Festival, and I am here with the very well known, actually, in certain circles, Dr. Dan O'Brien, who I'm a massive fan of. He didn't know this. I'm a fangirl. So I've been watching all his funeral stuff at Lifting the Lid and all these gruesome stories of history, weird stuff that makes sense of how we live now, that you'd think, oh, why do we do that? Why do we do that? Why do we do that? And there's all these brilliant reasons why we do the weird things we do. And this year's talk is no exception, because this year Dr. Dan is talking about coffins and the history around coffins and the traditions with that. Because you will think, oh, we all have always been put in boxes and buried, but it's not that simple. And there's all the reasons why that happened and all the historical precedents. So it's really exciting. I am going to let Dr. Dan introduce himself because he's fun and I know that will go well. So I'll hand over to you now, Dan.
Well, I'm Dr. Dan O'Brien. I'm a death historian. I've been death historianing for 20 years this year, remarkably. And I am fascinated with the different ways in which people try to organize death, try to make sense of, and try to give a sense of control, if they can, over a rampant problem which has faced people all throughout history. And one of the fascinating things that kind of interests me is that wherever you go in history, you find death and you find responses to death. And they really test the way that people behave, the things that are important to them, the things that they hold dear. And yeah, I've always been a really kind of enthusiastic student of that, kind of looking at the basics and thinking about, how these rituals at the center of people's societies formed? What traditions do they choose to enshrine? What innovations are they willing to undertake? So we have a lot of that coming up in my talk.
There's so many extensive ways. I'm not entirely sure that my microphone is plugged in, but I mean, I'm just going to
Oh,
go with it. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Yeah, I can
Oh,
definitely
well,
hear
let's
you.
just stay with it. You can hear me. Presumably, everyone else can hear me, and it'll still be recording one way or another. There are so many weird and wonderful ways and such extreme lengths to which we will go with regards to death. And I think if you don't work in the death industry or in death studies or anything around death and dying, you probably won't know that. You won't know the extremes to which people will go, how wedded they become to things that they consider tradition, because within their lifetime they've always been normal. But when then they actually ask themselves, why are we putting dad in a box? Why are we burying dad? Why? It all starts to become really, really interesting and quite challenging. And there are so many different cultural variations, aren't there? Like different things that people did during the plague, or different things that people did do in Ireland, or different kinds of linings and
Yeah.
coffins and things like that. Could you give us a little, I don't know, some kind of tidbit for people, the kind of thing and the kind of stories they might be expected to hear at your
Yeah.
talk?
But it really does touch upon some of those things. It's this sense of what is important to people at that moment and what do they want from the coffin, this very central object in the funeral. The coffin is at times both an avatar for the deceased but also a means for the living to make some statements about what they hold dear. And I think when we view it that way, there are some of the coffins that we'll encounter during the talk which really speak to a moment in time. Now, one of the really obvious examples, the very secure coffins that were produced in the late 18th century, early 19th century. These were devices that had two purposes, essentially. One, to appeal to the traditional ideal of a coffin, how it should look, to be decorated on the outside, all of those small touches that show that you care about the person within. And yet at the same time, within the coffin, they are surrounding the deceased person with a series of very intricate security measures, locks, bolts, pieces of metal, little bits of bar, to protect that body from anatomists and kind of grave robbers who might want to snatch it. So we have these two worlds, innovation and tradition, existing in one seemingly familiar box. And it's brilliant because when you see these coffins, they look outwardly just like a normal coffin of the period, a very stately, very well decorated, all the right handles, some nails around it as well. But on the inside, and when we find examples of these, there are a couple of examples that survive. The insides are a maze of different kind of countermeasures, and it really speaks to that, that the desire to be traditional, but also the desire to protect and to appeal to innovation for protection. That's a really
It's
obvious
amazing.
example. And that
I'm
was
going to
also
come
a
back. Just let
fairly
me move the
successful
internet.
example.
My router is not quite close enough to the computer, and I don't think I'm doing you justice. Give me a minute.
Okay.
Hopefully that's going to be a little bit better. I'm sorry about that. Tell
Cool.
us the rest.
That's
Carry
okay.
on.
Okay. So the next example, which I think really speaks to this mix of tradition and innovation, is the Bakelite coffin. Now, the Bakelite coffin is a product of the 20th century, and it comes around, it's invented, it's imagined at a time of conflict when wood is in quite short supply, when the materials for coffins are not necessarily available in the way that they were before. And the idea with a Bakelite coffin is to use this new wonder material, Bakelite, this kind of pre-plastic, to make a coffin, and to make a coffin which will fulfill a need in society, a familiar receptacle for the dead, but also one which uses new innovations, new technologies to overcome some of the problems of its time. The Bakelite coffin is less successful though, because quite unfortunately, Bakelite doesn't really decompose in the ground. So you're putting a non-decomposing material into the ground, and that coffin is not going to go anywhere. It's going to stay where it is. But worse still, there are reports that some of the coffins, when earth is thrown on the coffin lid, simply shatter because the way that Bakelite kind of takes the force of objects being thrown on it, the rather destructive effects, which, as you can imagine, the last thing you want at a funeral is for a coffin lid to be smashed open in front of all of the gathered mourners. So two different ideas there that kind of that we'll be looking at and kind of exploring their successfulness, but also what they tell us about their own time. Because I think one of the really interesting things about coffins is because they appear so frequently throughout history, they become a really interesting way of examining their attitudes to death. Who gets a coffin? Who doesn't get a coffin? What
Still
sorts of
horribly
coffins
true.
do they get? It is, and I think it's one thing. And the more I've researched it, the more I've seen around me. With the different options that are available. Um, as recently as this year, kind of being someone who's thinking about having a coffin and having a coffin for a relative. You start to think about these purchasing options, the kinds of materials involved, the consequences of some of those things as well. So I think it's a really fascinating way of kind of looking at an object to understand people, which I think is one of the really interesting aspects of death history, is you're studying the living using the dead and using kind of death rites. And I think it's amazing how living people really come alive in death rites. You see a lot of kind of attitudes and values in very raw terms as well. Um, and I think that's essentially what I hope to bring to the talk. We're going to be using most ubiquitous of funerary items, the coffin, the kind of symbol of the undertaker, to explore people, and their attitudes. I think, for people who've maybe not encountered funerary history, or maybe don't even really have too much of an interest in funerary history, I think there will be a lot for contemporary audience, for people who are invested in the trade today, or just have an interest in the way that we approach problems with funerary rites today. I think the past has answers, but it also has warnings as well.
Big warnings, and absolutely. And this thing of learning from history, in that history is never the same, and we're not, things change and nothing ever completely repeats. But absolutely, there are lessons to learn, and there's so much to know even now about economic deprivation and class and like national and global politics. I think if you don't study this kind of thing or have any understanding around the history of death, you don't realize the breadth of the topic. To just talk about a coffin is to be talking about global politics in a way. There's so many
Mm.
people being buried without coffins right now, and people not even being able to bury their dead or find the bodies, and all kinds of things around that. So it's a really big topic, and at the same time a really small topic. And I love that there's an epic suite, but it's so specific.
Mm.
And I'm really interested in the Bakelite thing. I don't know. Can you explain to people who don't know what Bakelite what it is, and why it was so popular at that time in history?
The Bakelite was a sort of wonder material. It's kind of plastic before plastic, and it uses wood fiber. And it was very easy to mold into a variety of different shapes. And this meant that effectively people could use Bakelite to make all manner of kind of household items. So probably the most obvious examples would be Bakelite telephones and Bakelite wireless radios. So it's quite a familiar thing of its time. And it's the sort of wonder material which I suppose, as with all of these imaginary kind of solutions to problems, um, it uses something that people are familiar with and see as being kind of symbolic of their time. I think it's easy to understand that potential customers to these things may have seen this as being quite a modern, if not slightly futuristic thing, a material that is at once very inorganic, but in a really kind of positive way. And nowadays, when we look at coffin materials, I think people tend to want more organic materials. They might think about decomposition, where the product's going to go. But at this point in time, the idea of having this durable wonder material is really quite appealing.
And they would have thought,
And I
in a
think it's
way,
interesting too, but
carry on.
I think it's interesting because it's when we look at coffins throughout time, there are lots of different materials that have periods of popularity, and a lot of them have kind of fallen out of popularity. I mean, lead was incredibly unpopular, very practical. And when we look at lead now and the way that it's been slightly kind of ostracized within society for its dangers and its harmfulness, um, we can perhaps see choices that people in the past have made that we wouldn't make today.
And this whole thing of protecting people from the inside, I can see how Bakelite might have felt like a really protective material in a
Mm.
really similar kind of way. But we don't have the same relationship to the body, do we, now that we had? So it must be really interesting to talk to contemporary audiences about this need to lock people in and protect them
Mm.
from. You've got two things, haven't you? You've got the grave robbing, and then you've got the idea of the body and how important the body is. And I'm interested in how that coffin is encasing a body and what that meant in that time. What were they protecting against? What was it about the
Yeah.
body that they felt they had to protect?
It is really interesting how this kind of very religiously framed desire to remain intact in the grave influences people's choices. If we look at medieval burial solutions, in the medieval, common people will be buried in the burial ground, and eventually their bones will be disinterred and placed in the charnel house. And there's that kind of cycle of disposal and kind of gathering that happens. But as we see the coffin become more popular, there's this desire to be contained, and it's often framed in terms of resurrection. Very religiously wanting to rise intact on the last day, and that's a really powerful idea in most people's minds, although it doesn't necessarily find explanation in the Bible. The desire to remain intact in the grave um, can be used in a variety of ways. For people promoting these items, the coffin is a way of achieving security and some kind of continuity in the ground. The person lies as they were placed. No, or at least there's less of a risk of disinterment, although really people are still being popped out of the ground. Um, but you also have this very interesting way in which punishment can then use that idea too. So whilst the righteous person achieves security in death, buried in the ground in their coffin, the criminal can be hung in a gibbet and kind of fed to the birds, or can be dismembered and placed in various locations as a warning to all. So that kind of sense of bodily integrity has a really interesting influence on people's um, visions for what they want of their own death, and kind of how the machinery of death, how the coffin and the various tomb structures will help them to secure that. And
And all
it's
these
quite
moral
interesting that when we
implications. Like you, the way, the
think
kind
they
of
are, yeah,
coffin
I
that
think
you
this
choose
is,
is like a moral thing.
yeah, and I think there's a very kind of keen sense that, if you want to, um, if you're a person of good standing, you need a good coffin as well. And there's a weird etiquette of coffins as well, where the more affluent you are, and the higher your standing in society, the more likely your coffin will not be placed in the ground, but it will be placed in a vault of a church underneath the church floor. And this, of course, brings other problems because if you're going to be placed under a church, then you need to be secure in hygienic terms because you don't want to be, in the most gruesome of terms, leaking out over the vault floor. So you start to need lots of additional protection. The living have to be protected from you. So your coffin might have an internal lead shell. It might have two wooden shells. So you might have an extra layer. And it's really curious to me how this kind of politics of coffin shells starts to speak to people's apparent standing in society, that within the kind of 17th, 18th, even into the 19th century, this sense that a coffin that maybe has two wooden shells, and you have different kinds of wood used, um, is something that people would want to know about as well. They might read in the newspaper that the coffin was a two-shelled coffin, and you start to get this very curious sense that people are seeing their own kind of societal standing in terms of how many coffins they're within. But again, also very practical. Until kind of interments are driven out of the churches. Um, yeah, it's quite fashionable to be buried under the
Oh,
floor, to be under,
I
in a
love this.
church vault, which
I love it so much. I can't believe it is so interesting. It's killing me. I just need to know what your favorite coffin is as well. I need to know because I know when I've watched yours before, you've had little characters that you've talked about
mm,
and particular
I
stories
have,
that
yes.
really caught your imagination. Are there any coffins that you've made friends with or that you really love?
There are actually a couple of really curious coffins just down. So I live in Wiltshire. I'm just about kind of 12 miles away from the city of Bath. And on the Bath-Wiltshire border, there's a castle called Farley Hungerford. It has a chapel, and underneath the chapel, there's a little vault, and it's got some coffins in it. Now, these coffins are really interesting because these are English coffins. These are coffins of kind of stately English people, and and yet they are lead anthropoid coffins. These are lead coffin shells that contain people, but look like the outline of people. They've got heads, they've got shoulders, they've got the outline of a body, and at the end they've got feet. So I suppose to the casual observer, they kind of look a bit like lead mummy cases, as in the kind of Egyptian mummy sense. I find these objects fascinating because I love the idea that people of a certain level of standing in the distant past, living in a castle on the edge of Wiltshire, decided that they wanted these kind of lead shells which really look like people. Of kind of, on the one hand, we might think of a coffin as kind of obscuring the human form, but here you have the human form described in lead, and so that I would say they are some of my favorite coffins, definitely. Um,
I
just
love that
because
you
they're so
found them.
unusually weird, and
Yeah, they sound really
they were
weird, and I
quite.
love that you found them. I feel like you'd find anything. You'd find any
Mm.
coffin anywhere because you're quite forensic about your your explorations. How did you find those?
I was just casually, so I must have seen them when I was much younger because we'd been to the castle before when I was a child, but um, I was there actually. That was, oh gosh, well over a decade ago now. When I was in my death studies course, we went to the castle for some reason. I don't know how it related to death studies, and I went into the crypt, and there were these three coffins behind a grate, and I was completely taken away. I was very impressed.
I love that the audience that we're gonna have, they're definitely people anyway, so you're like, you've already won them over before you start, but there are people out there that'll be like, "Why are they so excited about these coffins?" But
This
they are
good.
really
I
exciting
can fully
objects.
understand.
Yeah, yeah. But it is really
There's
neat
something
I
quite
get that.
magical. Mm,
Yeah, because the way in which you're getting an insight is what you said, that you're getting an insight into how people thought about the world. So if
mm,
you think now about how we look at the body, or we look, I mean, I'm constantly being told, don't have a funeral for me, put me out with the bins. It is that irrelevant to
mm,
so many people, at least they think it is. And then there's all kinds of debates about coffins being a waste of money. But these people that had themselves molded
mm.
in lead, they
Yeah,
thought it was worth spending a fortune, because that's not an inexpensive item, is it? A lead coffin
it's
shaped
a
like a
really
body.
expensive item. Yeah.
Yeah,
And it's
it's
interesting.
incredible.
It's something like that which can seem quite kind of humanoid and flimsy. It's actually really expensive stuff, and it's quite. I think I do find that, whenever I see coffins from the past. I remember I went to. I think it's been quite badly damaged by fire shortly after I went there, but St Michan's in Dublin, where they used to have a crypt underneath, and you could go into the crypt. I remember looking through one of the little portals, and there were some kind of fabric-lined coffins in there. So very, very traditional in their time, kind of covering a coffin in black or red fabric. And to see these in their pristine form was such a treat, because I've read about these, I've studied them, and very occasionally you can go into a church vault and you'll find a preserved example, and you think it's it's such a treat, because you can look upon it as the people at the time did, and kind of see it without any of the damage or without any of the problems that might occur in the ground. And yeah, it's just because nowadays when people talk about coffins, you have a sense in your mind of what a coffin is. So when you see historical versions where it kind of looks the same, something's not quite right. There's something missing, or something's a little bit different. I always find that fascinating, because it's interesting to think that we have this shared history of a coffin and what a coffin is. But like you say, people now kind of they don't want coffins, and it's what does the absence of a coffin mean? Because that's changed over time too. There was in the medieval, burying a shrouded body would have been perfectly respectful. Um, then there's a period of time where burying the dead without a coffin is an expression of either disastrous circumstances or ill fortune, someone who has fallen on very hard times. Um, so it's fascinating to think, what does the coffin mean? What does the absence, I guess, of the coffin mean? Um, and how does this one little very familiar object, when the undertaking trade bursts into life in London, the symbol that they choose is a coffin. I find that fascinating too, because if you think like the illiterate world, the kind of pre-industrial city where people do have literacy, but you can't always rely on it. So you have lots of business signs that are quite literally what the business person does. A cobbler might have a boot, a blacksmith might have a horseshoe, an optician will have a lenses, and the undertaker chooses the coffin. And it's just this idea that people in that period of time when the trade is so new can look up and they can see a coffin and they can think, an undertaker, that funeral business. And that's
And
kind of
then you've got
that's
all the
those are just some of the things I
questions.
enjoy, really.
Yeah, because it
Mm,
raises all the questions then, doesn't it? Why was that the case? And
mm,
then is that because that's how they made their money, actually making the boxes for, and then it's just all the marketing, and then it's just astonishingly interesting how we prioritize over different decades, and even in my lifetime those priorities have shifted dramatically for environmental
mm,
reasons or economic reasons. And now shrouds are coming back in among particular people that are into the
mm,
thing, and many people find them a little bit alarming, but there's now shrouding workshops. You can go and learn how to shroud, and for those of you that don't know what I'm talking about, you can wrap your person in cloth, and that was very normal, like before wooden coffins and stuff. And that's coming back in particular circles where people are learning how to wrap their own dead, and that's becoming a very intimate process that we feel that we had taken away
mm,
from us. And there's something distancing about a wooden or a hard shell. And that distancing, you've kind of explained to me why that might be something that came in and why that was a favoured thing.
mm.
And now there's a bit of a move towards a more intimate, softer kind of approach, or
Yeah.
literally nothing. Cardboard is big. And then
Mm,
decorating them and all the personality. But it's interesting you're saying about the lining of some of them, and then also the shape, the lead and the shaping. they're still unique, aren't they? They're still individualized. And I know we think about we're in an individualist culture, and we are. But for my sister, we had poppies printed on her white cardboard coffin, and I
Mm.
worked a lot with as a celebrant with funerals where people decorate, or even as part of the ceremony, you decorate the coffin. And it's really tempting for me to think that that's a new phenomenon, but it feels to me that what you've looked at, there's still artistic expression and personality in these items. Is that true?
Very much so, yeah. Yeah, I think it's one of the things that you discover when you, particularly when you look at kind of archaeology of grave sites as well, that there's quite a lot more personality in the coffin than maybe we expect from the kind of the outward account of the coffin itself. You know, the things that people have included in coffins, the way that those coffins are prepared, the way that they're decorated. And I think it really is interesting because it's, you know, we can look over time and we can see that, you know, one of the things that we all share is that desire to kind of express something of the person inside. We want that coffin to capture something of the identity of the person that's within, both to remind ourselves, but also, I guess, to, you know, to leave that person with something that very clearly identifies, you know, who they are. I think it is interesting because I think, you know, things do get lost, things get learned. I think the shroud stuff is really fascinating because I remember seeing some people discussing recently, you know, like, oh, you know, could we use shrouds? And I thought it is so fascinating that that kind of knowledge gets lost, and now it can be reclaimed as well because um, it is interesting how over time kind of the influence on who decides what has shifted backwards and forwards, and it seems like one of these kind of never-ending struggles a little, all the way from the kind of the Roman through to today, this kind of desire um, to get what you want from a funeral, but also at the same time to maintain that balance of control between you and the people who might perform it as well. So
Really? That's
obviously
so
the coffin is a really
interesting.
interesting, yeah, it's
Oh, I
it's
didn't
it's
know
one of those
that.
fascinating aspects that, you know, when you look at even with the emergence of the trade, there's a sense that, you know, you have to keep your wits about you when you're dealing with the trade. And it's like on the one hand, people are clearly very trustworthy of the trade and its products. But the idea that kind of suspicion underlies everything that you do in your interactions with them, you know,
I had
reminding
that
the
very
customer that they.
conversation. I mean, I actually had that
Mm,
conversation today with the funeral director. Hadn't said this and hadn't said
that's
that, and they'd been
fascinating.
disingenuous and they hadn't known. And I thought that was new. I hadn't realized that was an ancient thing.
Oh yeah, yeah. It's one of those really fascinating things that kind of lingers throughout the process. And the coffin is again another really great platform for that because the idea that the coffin might be in some ways not what it purports to be is one of those little kind of popular stories. You know, the sense that you'd pay a lot for a solid board coffin, but actually in reality it's a coffin made of planks, which is a cheaper form of construction, but it's concealed by the kind of decorations that you pop around the outside. So you're a very affluent customer, you've spent lots of money, you've got a lovely coffin, but actually on the inside it's a bit flimsy. And the hope there is that, you know, you don't realize, but the popular culture kind of encourages you to question and, you know, and to be a
I
bit more
really
firm
like
with your
it.
pressing.
It's like a real there's a real healthy suspicion actually. But I'm wondering, did they
Definitely.
ever do a thing where they would bury the person and then sneak under cover of darkness and reclaim the coffin and reuse it for other people?
So one of the interesting problems that kind of seems to recur throughout history is the use of a coffin for multiple burials when it hasn't been stated to have been used for multiple burials. So undertakers who choose to use one coffin for maybe two people or one coffin for several children or yeah, and within its own time it's a scandal because obviously it offends this idea that you've paid the undertaker for a product and that that product is very personal to you. So it's interesting that this level of scandal surrounding the contents of the coffin is something that kind of emerges with, you know, the coffin as a product in the kind of 18th and 19th centuries, and also, you know, the sense that you can that a coffin can conceal things. That makes it quite useful. If you're smuggling goods into the country, you put them in a coffin. The custom people are not likely to pry open a coffin. They don't want to see what's inside, really. So you can hide your brandy in the coffin and smuggle it in.
That's
And
brilliant.
and
I
that happens.
never
There
thought
are
of
a
that.
few really. curious cases of that, of people using coffins to smuggle goods in. One would imagine because no one in their right mind wants to pry open a used coffin. It's
It's perfect,
especially in
isn't it?
that time.
Perfect.
Yeah.
I wonder if people still do stuff like that. You never know. Oh my goodness, I've realised the
I would not
time,
be
which is
surprised.
lovely. No, I wouldn't either.
Oh goodness.
I want to tell everybody where they can find you before anything else. Because I mean, I will keep you on all day because I absolutely love this stuff. I would be amazed if anyone has heard you talk and doesn't want to come and hear more and learn all the goss of ancient times. So
So
we've got you in at GMT 7:15 in the evening till 8:15 on Friday the 14th, this
that's
Friday,
me.
and
This
all the way
Friday.
through this Friday the 14th at 7:15 here in the UK. But if you're not in the UK, you can go and have a look on the public programme and it'll give you all the time zones. So you're looking for Dr. Dan O'Brien, and the name of the session is really funny. So you're looking for coffins, open and shut case. And I'm just going to read now what we've got. Coffins are a very recognisable and familiar part of our response to death, but how did they come to be? And so if you come to this, it's going to be taking you on a journey from medieval stone sarcophagi through anthropoid lead shells, which are the ones we just talked about, to the wartime experiments with new materials like the Bakelite. So this will be richly illustrated, and I can confirm that there are always great pictures with these presentations. And we will consider why coffins were made, what the construction tells us about attitudes to death and dying. And at the heart of the talk is a discussion, as Dan just told us, about the innovation and how new ideas have shaped our response to death. And that really is the heart of it. That's what's so interesting. If you want to know Dr. Dan's bio, go on to our public programme, and there's loads there about his extensive research and amazing work and lots of success and important accolades that you must look up. I mean, he's a really modest, very, very sweet man, but he's actually really, really impressive. And definitely, you know, that thing where you choose guests for your dinner party, if you were having a dinner party, you could choose anyone from history. You're going to be there talking about coffins. I'm going to invite you, and that would be brilliant. Because most
Happy
of
to
my
come
friends
along.
will handle it. Yeah. Most of my friends will handle it really well. Is there anything else
It's good
that
to
we
know.
want to tell people? Like, we need to know where we can find you in the atmosphere. Where are you to be found?
Yes. So you can find me on Instagram. My Instagram is let me just check. It is Dr. Dan, Dr.Dan.O. So if you search for Dr. Dan O'Brien on Instagram, I'm there. I'm also on TikTok now, with similar content. And that's at the same handle. So if you look for Dr. Dan O on TikTok, I'm there as well. Doing my usual thing, kind of talking about graveyards, burial, undertakers, and lots of mourning jewelry as well, because I enjoy that.
I love your
Another
Instagram
topic for
feed.
another day.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm definitely hoping that you'll come on my podcast and talk about that. Have you got a website, Dan?
I don't have a website at the moment. No. I need
Oh.
to get onto that really, actually.
You do.
Little
But we'll
internet
find you on
home for
Instagram
myself.
and TikTok in the meanwhile. And I will reference everything when I download this, and I'll upload it to my YouTube, and then we'll put all of your handles and socials, and that'll stay up all year. So you can revisit this if you've not been able to watch it all the way through. We're going to put a reel out on socials, and then we're going to see you on Friday the 14th, this Friday, at what did we say, 7:30 or 7:15?
I think it was 7:30.
7:15. 7:15.
7:15.
Don't miss the first 15
Cool.
minutes. So I'm going to say goodbye to everyone, but keep you on, and then we'll carry on. Thanks, everybody.